Her own aunt sold the child's boots and marched her into the poorhouse at dawn. The boots were what I couldn't get past. I know that sounds like a strange thing to fix on. There was the rest of it too, the aunt's face when she turned away at the gate, that flat, finished look like she'd set down a load she'd been carrying too long. The child not crying. That was the part that caught in me and stayed. Not the crying, the not crying. Like she'd used it all up somewhere before this morning and had nothing left to spend. But the boots, she wasn't wearing any. January. The ground outside the Harlow County poorhouse was iron hard and there was a skin of ice on every puddle. The child had on a dress too thin for October and no boots, and she walked through that gate ahead of her aunt the way you walk when you've learned that hesitating only makes it worse. I was there to pick up a load of split wood the county sold off cheap in winter. I had a wagon and a team, and no particular reason to be watching the intake gate, except that I'd been awake since before light and my mind had nowhere useful to go. I watched the aunt speak to the man at the door. I watched her reach into her coat and pull out something small, a folded paper, county form of some kind, and hand it over. The man looked at it and looked at the child and stepped aside, and the aunt turned and walked back through the gate without once looking at the girl. I don't know why I got down off that wagon. I don't have a good answer for it even now, all these years on. I got down and I stood at the fence and I said to the man at the door, loud enough to carry, I said, "That child have any belongings coming?" The man looked at me like I was a smell he didn't care for, said it wasn't my affair. I said, "Whose affair is it then?" He didn't answer. The girl was still standing just inside the door. She turned and looked at me. She had dark eyes, almost black, too old in her face by 15 years, 8 years old maybe, 9 at most. She looked at me the way a trapped animal looks, not begging, just measuring, figuring the odds. I went around to the intake office. Took me a while. I had to explain myself twice to the same man and a third time to a woman who ran the desk inside, and I could tell they thought I was simple or drunk or both. I asked if there was a record of the girl's property. The woman checked a ledger. There was an entry. 1 pair leather boots, girl's size, surrendered at intake by the family guardian. Surrendered. I asked what that meant, surrendered. The woman explained, patient as a person explaining to someone simple, that family members sometimes surrendered the child's possessions to offset county intake fees. The boots had already been taken to the resale shed. I went to the resale shed, found a man there who smelled of tobacco and wet wool. He knew which boots, showed them to me. Small things worn at the heel but whole. Someone had kept them resoled. I paid what he asked without haggling, which I could tell surprised him. I went back inside and I gave the boots to the woman at the desk and I said, "See, she gets those." The woman looked at me. I said, "I'll be back in a week. I'll ask her directly if she got them." I don't know why I said that. The child wasn't mine. I had no claim and no standing and no plan past that moment. But I said it, and the woman wrote something in her ledger, and I went back out and loaded my wood and drove the wagon back to the Creel Ranch, where I'd been foreman for going on 9 years. Her name was Dory. I found that out when I came back the following week, which I did because I'd said I would, and I was not in the habit of saying things I didn't mean. I asked the woman at the desk if the child had received the boots. The woman said she had. I asked if I could see her. There was a delay, more explaining. A supervisor was found. Eventually they brought her out to a room with 2 wooden chairs and a window that looked onto a frozen yard. She was wearing the boots. She sat down across from me and looked at me with those old eyes and said, "You're the man from the gate." I said I was. She said, "Why did you do that, with the boots?" I thought about it. I said, "It wasn't right what they did." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "My aunt sold them to pay the county. She needed the money." I said, "I know. You didn't have to get them back." "No." She looked at the boots. She had them crossed at the ankle, the way a child sits when they're being careful to act grown. She said, "My name is Dory, Dory Marsh." I told her my name. She repeated it back to me the way you repeat something you want to remember. I came back the week after that, and the week after that. I don't know exactly when it stopped being a thing I was doing and became a thing I did, the way you bank a stove or check the horses at last light, just part of the shape of the week. I'd bring small things, a pair of wool stockings, a book once. She read it in a week and told me everything wrong with the ending. She was 9 years old and she had opinions like a woman of 40. The county allowed foster arrangements. I looked into it in March, which tells you something about where my head was by then. There was paperwork. There was a home inspection, which meant a county man came out to the Creel Ranch and walked through my quarters, 2 rooms off the tack barn, and looked at the kitchen and the outhouse and the state of things generally. Old Bob Creel was still alive then, and he stood in the yard and watched the county man and didn't say anything until the man was about to leave. Then Bob said, "Dalt's been on this ranch 9 years. He knows every board and every cow and every hand. You look for a better man to keep a child safe, you won't find him." The county man wrote something down. He left. Dory came to live at the Creel Ranch in April, just after the ground thawed enough to work. I moved my cot into the second room and set up the first room for her. It wasn't much, a bed, a chest, a hook on the wall. She stood in the doorway the first morning and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she put her one bag on the chest and she said, "It's clean." I said I cleaned it. She said, "I know." She looked at me, "Thank you." She was not a sentimental child. I want to be clear about that, because some people hear this story and imagine a small weeping girl and a gruff man with a soft heart revealed, and that's not what this was. Dory was exact and watchful, and when she trusted you, she showed it by telling you the truth, straight, without softening it first. That took some getting used to. She told me once, about a month in, that she decided I was probably a good man. I asked what probably meant. She said she didn't give full credit until she had more evidence. I said that was fair. She was 10 by then. She started school in town that fall. She was ahead of most of the other children in reading and behind in arithmetic, which she worked on until she wasn't behind anymore, which took her about 4 months. She brought her schoolwork to the kitchen table in the evenings, and I sat at the other end with the ranch ledgers, and we worked in the same lamp light without talking much, and that was enough. That was, I think, what she needed. Just someone else in the room who was staying put. I want to tell you about the aunt because you might be thinking the aunt was some kind of villain, some cold creature who hated the child. I don't know that she did. Dory's parents had died of fever 2 years before, a summer sickness that moved fast through that part of the county. The aunt had taken Dory in, and the aunt had 3 children of her own and a husband who worked irregular and a house that was already short on room and shorter on money. I don't know what the boots cost. I don't know what the intake fee was. I know that people do hard things when they're worn down to the bone, and I know that hard things done to children leave marks the children carry, whether they mean to or not. Dory never spoke much about her aunt. Once, maybe when she was 14, she said, "I don't hate her, I think she just got tired." Then she went back to what she was doing. That was the end of it. The marks were there, though. She didn't ask for things. Not once in all the years she lived on the Creel Ranch did Dory Marsh come to me and ask for something she wanted. If she needed something, boots outgrown, a coat that had seen its last winter, she'd find a way to mention it sideways, practical, like she was reporting a fact about the ranch and not about herself. Ropes worn through on the south gate. The coat's not going to last another season. I learned early on to listen for that, and to act on it before she had to say it twice. It was not a sacrifice. I want to be clear about that too. Men talk about raising a child not their own like it's a martyrdom, some long selfless suffering. It wasn't that. It was just living. 2 people in a small set of rooms and a big piece of country outside, making things work. I was better for having someone to account to, if I'm honest. A man alone gets narrow, gets to thinking his habits are the shape of the world. Having Dory there kept me from getting too narrow. She'd look at some way I did something and ask why I did it that way, and half the time I didn't have a good answer, and that was good for me. Bob Creel died in the winter Dory turned 16. Left the ranch to his son James, who lived in Denver and had no interest in cattle or hard country. James came out that spring, looked at the books, looked at the land, decided he was going to sell. I'd known something like this was coming, and I'd been setting money aside for 7 years, slow, careful, a man putting coins in a jar. Enough for a small place. Not the Creel spread, nothing like it, but enough for 30 acres and a house with more than 2 rooms. I bought the Penter place west of town. Dory helped me move, which mostly meant she told me what needed to go first and kept me from loading things in the wrong order. We walked through the house the evening of moving day after the hands had gone. 3 rooms, a real kitchen, a porch that faced west. The light was going gold on everything. Dory stood on the porch and looked at the country going dark in the distance. She said, "It's a good place." I said, "I think so." She said, "You could have gone further, easier country, you stayed because of me." I started to say something about how the land was priced right and the water was sound. She turned and looked at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not quite tears, just full somehow. She said, "Don't explain it away. I know what you did, I've always known." I didn't say anything. She said, "I want you to know I know, that's all." She went inside and started unpacking the kitchen things. I stood on the porch for a while in the last of the light. She was 17 when a man named Corey Finch started coming around. He was 24, worked at the mill, not a bad-looking fellow, and he'd set his eye on Dory in a way that I didn't much care for because it had the same quality as a man looking at a good piece of land he means to acquire. I watched him twice, and both times he talked to me longer than he talked to her, which told me what I needed to know about how he thought of things. I didn't forbid it. She wasn't a child you forbade things to, and she was old enough besides. I watched. He asked her to a dance in town. She went. She came home in the wagon with a face that was doing the work of not giving anything away. I was at the table with a lamp and a cup of coffee, and I didn't say anything and she didn't say anything, and then she sat down across from me and she said, "He's not a good man." I said, "No." She said, "You knew." I said, "I thought so." She was quiet for a while, then she said, "You didn't say anything." I said, "Not my place to say. You're smart enough to see for yourself." She looked at me for a long time, then she said, "That's a respectful thing to do." I said it wasn't anything. She said it was, though. Corey Finch came around twice more after that, and both times Dory was pleasant and clear and had somewhere to be. He stopped coming. There were 2 other men in the next 3 years, both better than Finch. One of them, a quiet fellow named Aldous who ran a freighting operation out of the next county, was good enough that I thought something might come of it. He treated her squarely, didn't try to manage her. But after about 8 months she told me he wanted to move north, up into the territory, and she wasn't willing to go that far from the ranch. I asked if she was sure. She said she was. I said, "You're not staying on account of me." She said, "I'm staying on account of me. This is my place too." I left it there. The second man was a widower from town, a few years older than Dory, 2 boys of his own, a man who seemed decent and steady. They kept company for almost a year. I liked him well enough. Then one morning Dory came to the kitchen and poured herself coffee and said it was finished. I asked what happened. She said he'd told her she reminded him of his first wife. Said it like it was the highest compliment a man could give. I said I could see how that would land wrong. She said he was looking for her, not me, there's a difference. I said there is. She drank her coffee. We didn't talk about it again. Dory turned 22, the spring the roof needed replacing. I'd been putting it off because the quotes I'd gotten from town were steep, and I thought I could get another season out of the old cedar. But the winter had been brutal, and there were places letting water, and I knew I was done waiting. I was up on the roof doing my own inspection when I heard a horse come into the yard, and then the gate, and then Dory's voice talking to whoever it was. I came down off the roof after a while and found her on the porch with a man I didn't know, younger than me by some margin, trail dusty, just arrived in the county from the look of him. They were talking easy, the way people talk when the talking surprised them by starting and then just kept going. I went to the barn and let them be. That evening she told me his name was Garrett and he'd come out from Missouri following a land notice and was looking for a place to put down. I asked what she thought of him. She looked at the fire. She said, "He listens. He asks questions and then he actually listens." I said, "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not. He came back. He kept coming back. I watched him the way I'd watched the others, but what I saw was different. He looked at Dory the way you look at something you can't quite believe your luck in finding, not like land to be acquired, like something already valuable to itself that might, if it chose to, include you. One evening in late summer he came to the porch when Dory was inside and asked if he could speak with me. We sat on the steps. He said he wanted to court Dory properly, and he wanted me to know it and wanted to know if I had any objections. I said it wasn't my call. He said he knew that, but it mattered to him what I thought because he understood I was the person who'd built a life around her, and he figured a man who'd done that had earned a hearing. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "She'll tell you herself if she wants you here. If she does, you'll know. If she doesn't, no amount of my blessing changes anything." He smiled a little. He said, "I think I'm learning that." Dory chose him. It took her another 4 months, and she did it on her own terms and on her own timeline, which surprised nobody. The evening she told me, she sat down at the kitchen table and said it plain, no ceremony. Then she said, "I need you to know something." I waited. She said, "Everything I know about how a good man acts, the standard I was measuring everybody else against, that came from you. You probably knew that, but I wanted to say it out loud at least once." She wasn't a woman who said things twice. She'd said it and she meant it, and that was enough. I said, "You did the growing yourself." She said, "Don't explain it away." I didn't. They were married in October at the ranch, under a sky so blue it looked painted. Not many people. A few from town, a couple of the old hands from the Creole days, Garrett's family from Missouri, Dory in a dress the color of winter wheat. I walked her to where Garrett stood because she asked me to, and I would have burned the world down before I'd have said no. At the end of the evening, when most people had gone and the lamps were low and Garrett was saying his goodbyes near the gate, Dory found me by the fence at the west side of the yard. She stood beside me, and we looked at the country going dark the same way we'd looked at it the evening we moved in, the same hills, the same distance. She put her hand through my arm and stood close, the way she'd never much done, and she said quietly, "This is a good place." I said, "It is." She said, "You made it that." We stood there for a little while. The night was cold, and the stars were coming in hard from the east, and out at the gate I could hear Garrett laughing at something, and Dory had her hand on my arm and her head turned toward the dark hills, and I thought, this is the shape of a life that turned out right. A man who stepped in when there was need and stayed when there wasn't, and stood between a child and the cold for long enough that she grew into a woman who knew her own worth. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. I didn't need a name on a deed or blood in a line. I needed to know that she knew she was worth standing for. She knew. I felt that all the way to the ground.